Alright, hi guys, we're going to do a quick review of the Phillips curve. I never draw the Phillips curve without drawing the aggregate demand curve just because, not the aggregate demand, the aggregate model, because the Phillips curve does not have its own shifters, and so it just makes it easier if you know what's going on in your aggregate model, which you should already be comfortable with, to be able to just read that and then make the changes to your Phillips curve. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll start off with the aggregate model. So remember that we have price level on the y-axis, real GDP on the x-axis. We have the long run aggregate supply curve. We have aggregate supply to the sky, the short run, and then aggregate demand to the land. On this graph, we're going to go ahead and start off at full employment. So E1, Q1, PL1. Sorry about that. All right, so moving on to our Phillips curve. So now how we have inflation on the aggregate model, price level on the aggregate model, we'll have inflation on the Phillips curve. So inflation goes on the y-axis and unemployment on the x-axis. Our short-run Phillips curve is downward sloping, so SRPC, short-run Phillips curve, sorry about that, is downward sloping because there is an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. We also have a long-run Phillips curve, kind of like we do on the aggregate model. And so if we're going to be at full employment, our equilibrium on the Phillips curve would be right there, although technically I guess it's not an equilibrium. Label all your points because it's not really intersecting with anything else. Percentage 1, just because I don't put numbers here like 1, 2, 3. You know that it increases as you go up, but I don't put numbers because we're not given numbers, and I don't want you to get in the habit of putting numbers because, you know, I don't want you to be docked points on the AP exam for something like that. All right, so both models, the aggregate model and the Phillips curve, are right now at full employment. Now let's say that aggregate demand increases for whatever reason. So aggregate demand increases. We know that an increase on this graph is a movement to the right, right? Well, it's on both graphs, right? Increase, move to the right. So we draw our new curve, AD2. Label our new points, E2, Q2, PL2. All right, so we know that price level increased, output increased, and we are in what kind of gap? We're in an inflationary gap. So in an inflationary gap, we know that what happened to the unemployment level? We know that the unemployment level has decreased, that our unemployment level is lower than the natural rate of unemployment. So when we move over here to this graph, I just like to put my pen on the equilibrium so we can figure out where our new equilibrium will be. So we know that price level increased, and again we know that we're in an inflationary gap now and that unemployment decreased. So our equilibrium on this graph would be somewhere there. So label your new points, E2, U2, and %2. Notice how we only have one short-run aggregate supply curve, so we will only have one short-run Phillips curve. And that's how you can kind of check yourself. If you have two short-run aggregate supplies, then you will have two short-run Phillips curve on this side. But all you're doing is just reading what happened to price level, it went up. What happened to the unemployment rate? Inflationary gap means it went down. So we moved over here, and that's how we got to that point. Okay, let's try another one. So again, on an exam, if they're asking you draw the Phillips curve, they say nothing about aggregate demand. They're not going to take off points if you draw the aggregate demand curve to help you figure out what's going on your Phillips curve. But, you know, I would do it just to make sure that, you know, you're doing everything correctly. So price level, real GDP, long run aggregate supply, aggregate supply to the sky, aggregate demand to the land. And again, I like to start off at full employment most of my stuff, just because it makes things easier. Okay, and then we have our Phillips curve. Inflation goes on the y-axis. Unemployment on the x-axis. We have our short-run Phillips curve downward sloping. And our long-run Phillips curve is a vertical line. Again, label your points. Okay, remember that when you're on the LRPC that you are at the natural rate of unemployment. So we're at full employment if we're there, 4 to 6% unemployment. All right, unemployment increases as you move to the right, decreases as you move to the left on this graph, which is unemployment on this one is the opposite. If you're on the right side of the LRAS, kind of like we're over here with the inflationary gap, then that means that our unemployment rate is less than the natural rate of unemployment. So it's kind of like a little mirror image of it. Let's say on this one that aggregate supply decreases. So aggregate supply, we move to the left. Draw your new curve, AS2. Remember that your equilibrium is wherever your short-run aggregate demand curve and your aggregate supply curve intersect. So that's why equilibrium is over here. Label your new points, E2, Q2, PL2. All right, so what kind of gap is this? It is a recessionary gap. Price level has increased, output has decreased, we are inefficient, and our unemployment rate is higher than our natural rate of unemployment. Remember also, whenever your aggregate supply shifts to the left, and you're in this kind of predicament right here where price level increased and your unemployment rate increased, then this is what's also known as what? Stagflation, okay? So we move over here to our Phillips curve, okay? Again, we said price level increase, so we put our pen right there. Price level has increased. We're in a recessionary gap, so we know that our unemployment rate has also increased. So we move somewhere over here. Again, you can't have a little equilibrium just floating out there in the middle of nowhere, so you have to draw a new curve, a new short-run Phillips curve. So label that short-run Phillips curve 2. Label your new point somewhere around there. E2, U2, and %2. Remember, guys, that you can always pause before I actually give away the answer, just to test yourself and see if you're actually on the right track. So, okay, you want to try another one? Let's go ahead and say that government spending has increased. There's an increase in government spending. So again, draw your aggregate model. We'll go ahead and start it off at full employment. So we have price level on the y-axis, real GDP on the x-axis, the long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply to the sky, aggregate demand to the land. Label your new equilibrium, your quantity 1, and price level 1. And then go ahead and draw your Phillips curve. So we have inflation on the y-axis, unemployment on the x-axis. We have the short-run Phillips curve, which is downward sloping. The long-run Phillips curve, vertical. Unemployment 1, inflation rate 1, E1. Okay. So let's say again, government spending increased. We know that government spending is a shifter of the aggregate demand curve. And since it's an increase in government spending, that means it's an increase in aggregate demand. So we draw our arrow to the right, draw our new aggregate demand curve, oops, AD2. Label your new equilibrium E2, Q2, and PL2. Okay? So what kind of gap are we in now? An inflationary gap. And what happened to the unemployment rate? Did that increase or decrease? It decreased. Our unemployment rate is less than the natural rate of unemployment. Our price level has increased, unemployment rate has decreased, and output has increased. So we move on to the Phillips curve, Phillips graph. We know that again, price level has increased. We know that the unemployment rate decreased. So our new equilibrium on the Phillips curve will be somewhere right around there. Label all your new points. Percentage 2. So again, price level increased, unemployment rate decreased. We're in an inflationary gap. Okay, let's go ahead and take it a step further and say what happens in the long run. Well, in the long run, we know that price level increased and our workers are going to be like, hey, I can't afford my life, I need a raise. I'm not cutting it with no $7 an hour, so give you a $20 raise. So if our resources are now more expensive, then our workers, if our workers are now more expensive, then our resources are more expensive. Resource prices is a shifter of aggregate supply, so if they're more expensive, that's a decrease in aggregate supply. So we draw our new curve, AS2, again, our equilibrium is wherever our aggregate demand and our aggregate supply, the short run aggregate supply curve intersect. Don't get confused by this one because this is where this curve is like it no longer exists once you made this 82. So we label our new points, quantity 3 and price level 3. So now we just have to read this graph to know what happened on this graph. So we know that price level increased and we went back to full employment. We were in an inflationary gap. We were at, let's say, I don't know, 1% unemployment, and we went back to full employment, which is 4 to 6%. So that means that it increased. So we know that price level increased and our unemployment rate increased. We went back to full employment, so we have to be back on the LRAS, so it has to be somewhere right around here. So you have to draw a brand new curve, short run Phillips curve. Okay, so label all your new points, E3, U3, and percent 3. So equilibrium, E1, E2, E3, E1, E2, E3. If you can see here, we have two short run aggregate supply curves, so we have two short run Phillips curves. If you could grab this graph and flip it over, it would be the exact same graph minus the aggregate demand. So you see there's two aggregate supplies, two short run Phillips curves, two short run aggregate supplies, two short run Phillips curves. I don't know if y'all can like see that. It just kind of mirrors itself. Okay, let's try another one. Let's go with an increase in productivity. Again, you guys can pause the video, try and draw out the two graphs on your own, and see if you can make the changes. See if you get it correctly all by yourself. Don't wait for me. So again, we have price level, real GDP, long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply. Whoops, sorry, too many A's. Aggregate demand 1, E1, Q1, price level 1. Okay. Now we draw our Phillips curve. So we have inflation on the y-axis, unemployment on the x-axis. We have the short-run Phillips curve and the long-run Phillips curve. Oops. So again, the short-run Phillips curve is a mirror of the aggregate supply. One aggregate supply, one short-run Phillips curve. We're starting both of the graphs at full employment. Okay, and again, we're saying that there is an increase in productivity. So productivity is the P in IRAP, change in productivity. And since there's an increase in productivity, that means there's an increase in aggregate supply. So an increase in aggregate supply is a shift again to the right. So you draw your arrow, draw your new curve, AS2, E2, Q2, and price level 2. So then we just read what happened. What kind of gap is this? Inflationary gap. What happened to price level? It decreased. What happened to output, real domestic output or real GDP? It increased. What happened to the unemployment rate? It decreased because we're in an inflationary gap. So it is lower than the natural rate of unemployment. We're at like 2%, 1%, 0% unemployment if we're out here. So again, we move over to our Phillips curve and we put our pen right on the equilibrium. What are we saying happened to price level? We're saying that it decreased, so we move our pen down. What happened to the unemployment rate? We're saying that it decreased because we're in an inflationary gap. So we should be somewhere over here. Am I right? Well, you can check. Here, I'm going to have to draw another short-run Phillips curve. So 2 short-run Phillips curves, 2 short-run aggregate supply curves. So that's how you check yourself again, remember? So E2, U2, %2. Okay. I would not do the long run because the long run is not, I haven't gone over that with you guys in class, so don't worry about that for now. Or we'll just leave it just like that. What happened in the short run? Okay. Let's go ahead and do another one. Let's say that consumer spending has decreased. So a decrease in consumer spending. Again, draw your graph, your aggregate model. We have price level on the y-axis, real GDP on the x-axis, the long run aggregate supply curve. We have the short run aggregate supply, aggregate demand to the land, E1, Q1, price level 1. Now for our Phillips curve. So we have inflation on the y-axis, unemployment on the x-axis, this short-run Phillips curve, downward sloping, we have the long-run Phillips curve, which is vertical. Alright, so let's say that again, consumer spending decrease. Consumer spending is a change in aggregate demand, and since it's a decrease in consumer spending, that means it's a decrease in aggregate demand, so we move our aggregate demand curve. Sorry, the paper's moving. Aggregate demand curve to the left. Draw your new curve, AD2, E2, Q2, and price level 2. Now we read what happened here. We have price level decrease. What kind of gap are we in? We're in a recessionary gap. So that means our unemployment rate is higher than the natural rate of unemployment. and our output is low. Output low, price is low, unemployment high. So we move over here to our Phillips curve. We're saying that price level has increased. Oops, I did not label my points. Sorry about that. E1, U1, percentage 1. Okay, so again, price level has decreased. So on our graph we have our pen, price level decreased or inflation decreased. And we're in a recessionary gap, so that means that unemployment has increased. We are higher than the natural rate of unemployment. We're in a recession, so that's E2. Label all your new points, U2, %2. So this is similar to the one that we did before. We can go ahead and do the next step of what happens in the long run. Price levels have decreased. Our workers are very understanding. And they're like, oh, okay, we'll go ahead and accept a pay cut. And if our resources are cheaper, because we're having to pay them less, the workers, then that means aggregate supply will increase, so it'll move to the right. So you draw your new aggregate supply curve. Label your new equilibrium, your new quantity, and your new price level. So what happened to price level? It decreased. Output increased, but what happened to the unemployment rate? Here, let's say we were at 15-20% unemployment. Over here, we're back at 4 to 6% unemployment. So that means that it decreased, right? We went back to full employment. So we know that we went back to full employment, and we know that price level decreased. So we move down a little bit. Draw your new short run Phillips curve. Label all your new points. Unemployment 3 and %3. So we went back to full employment, but at a lower price level. Okay. If y'all need any more help with the Phillips curve, please feel free to, send me a message and I'll try and help you out some more. All right. Thanks, guys.